the deep dive. You know, something we all kind of wrestle with, maybe without always thinking about it, is that big question. Who exactly are we? It sounds so simple on the surface, but it really opens up a whole world of complexity.
It really does.
So today we're going to try and unpack some of that. We're looking at how we define ourselves, as individuals, but also how we fit into bigger groups.
Exactly. And for this, we're diving into Alin Gavriliuk's book, Social Cognition, The Construction of the Self in Social Contexts. Specifically, we'll be digging into Chapter 14.
Ah, yes. The one on cognition and the self-social identity theory. Self-construal, culture, and selfhoods. Quite a mouthful, but sounds fascinating.
It is. Think of this as our attempt to get under the hood of identity construction, how culture shapes us, why things are maybe more fluid than they seem. We want to pull out the core ideas and, make them really click.
Okay, sounds good. So where do we start? Gavriliuk kicks things off with this slightly philosophical angle, does he? The ambiguity of it all.
He does. He mentions Heidegger's AA, a thing is itself. Simple enough.
Right. A cat is a cat.
But then he brings in this concept from Western thought called intercession. What's that about? It sounds a bit formal.
Yeah, what does that actually mean for, regular people trying to figure themselves out?
Well, the key idea is that identity isn't just something you declare in a vacuum. AA is fine, but intercession suggests you need a context.
Yeah.
And you need someone else to kind of receive that identity declaration.
Ah, okay, so it's not enough for me to just think I'm a great baker.
Exactly. That identity gets real, socially speaking, when you bake a cake, give it to friends, and they actually say, wow, this is amazing.
Right, that recognition, that feedback loop.
Yeah.
That's the intercession.
Precisely. And Gavriliuk says these interactions generate identity discourses.
Yeah.
You're performing your identity for someone who cares, basically. Being a teacher, being a husband, being Orthodox, these identities are directed outwards.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense on the individual level. And he extends this to groups too, right? Using the example of Romania joining the EU.
Yeah, that's a great example of collective identity needing that intercession. Romania had its identity before joining the status quo. The goal, the desired identity, was EU member state. The means were all the negotiations, the strategy document.
All the hoops they had to jump through.
Right. But the crucial recipient, the ones doing the interceding, were the EU bodies. Their recognition, their acceptance was what solidified that new aspect of Romania's national identity.
So even something as big as national identity isn't just there. It needs that external validation, that interaction.
Exactly. It's not formed in isolation.
Which leads us straight to that fundamental question Gavriliuk poses. Is identity just a given, something natural we're born with, or is it fundamentally a cultural construct built through interaction?
And that's where the theories really diverge. He lays out two main approaches, substantialist and interactionist. Let's tackle the substantialist one first. What's the gist of that view?
Okay, substantialist.
Yeah.
It sounds like it focuses on substance, right? Solid stuff. So it argues identity comes from these more objective, maybe unchanging things, like our biology, our ancestry, our national history. It's like there's an eternal essence inside us defining who we are. And for nations, it emphasizes this deep historical root, a shared culture, maybe a Volksgeist or national spirit passed down.
Exactly. It's often presented as this almost undeniable historical fact. Gavriliuk brings up Herder from the 18th century to illustrate this. Why was Herder talking about the Volk back then? What was happening?
Right, Herder, well, Germany wasn't unified then, was it? It was all these separate states and kingdoms.
Correct, a real patchwork.
So Herder's idea of the Volk, this unique cultural group with its own spirit, its own language, its own traditions, it kind of gave a basis for thinking about Germanness beyond just political borders. It was like saying, we share something deeper.
Precisely. He saw each Volk as unique, almost organic. Gavriliuk mentions Herder's metaphor of a nation being like a natural plant.
Yeah, growing in its own soil. That really captures that substantialist identity as something deep-rooted, natural, inherited.
And this line of thinking carries forward, doesn't it? It connects to what anthropologists like Geertz called primordialism.
Ah, primordial ties. Yeah, the idea that our culture gives us a fundamental lens on reality and things like kinship, religion, language.
Yeah.
They create these incredibly strong, often unconscious emotional bonds.
Right. Geertz talked about the ineffable and overwhelming coercion of these ties. It suggests something more profound than just learned habits.
It feels almost built in, doesn't it? That gut feeling of belonging.
It really does. But then the interactionist theories come along and say, hold on, What's their counterargument?
Okay, so interactionists flip it. They say identity isn't this fixed essence. It's dynamic.
Yeah.
It develops and changes through our relationships with others. It depends on the context, psychological, social, cultural, historical. It's less about objective traits and more about the subjective meaning we build, how we represent ourselves to others.
Exactly. It's a process of construction. Gavrilyuk mentions Lipyansky suggesting we analyze this using tools from social psychology, like how we categorize people into in-groups and out-groups, from psychoanalysis, how we identify with others, and even semiotics, how identity is represented through symbols and language.
So it's much more about the doing than the having. If substantialism is about inherited essence, interactionism is about ongoing negotiation.
That's a great way to put it. It's about identity strategies, how we present ourselves, and Gavrilyuk brings in Renan's idea here.
Oh, the daily plebiscite. Ideation being like a daily vote of confidence.
Yes. That really captures the active, ongoing consent required from this perspective. It's not just heritage. It's a continuous choice to belong.
It seems like our basic understanding of reality itself plays a role here, too. Gavrilyuk mentions Berger and Luckman.
The sociology of knowledge, yeah. To grasp identity, you need to grasp how a society defines reality. Lipyansky's study on French identity is a case in point.
What did that show? How did French identity get studied in this interactionist way?
Well, Lipyansky looked at times when French identity felt like it was in crisis, maybe due to immigration or globalization. He argued that Frenchness wasn't just about fixed ethnic traits anymore.
Okay.
It became more about shared social representations, myths, values, ideologies often defined in contrast to others, like Germany. Identity was being actively constructed and negotiated in response to social change.
So identity is shaped by the conversation, by the comparison with the other.
Exactly. It's a dynamic response.
Okay, so we've looked at the big picture, the social context. Let's zoom back in on the individual self. Gavrilyuk talks about this idea that we don't just have one self, right? We have multiple particular selves.
Yeah, that's the idea of multiple selves. Think about it. You're probably a bit different with your boss than with your best friend or your parents or your kids.
Definitely. Different roles, different facets.
Right, and people vary in self-complexity, basically. How many distinct, independent roles or aspects make up their self-concept? Having higher complexity can be protective. Well, if you have setbacks in one area, say at work, it doesn't totally crush your overall sense of self-worth. If you also strongly identify as a musician, a volunteer, a great sibling, etc.
Like having more legs on the table. If one wobbles, it doesn't collapse.
Exactly. It provides resilience.
So if we have all these different selves floating around,
Yeah.
how do we maintain any sense of being a coherent me? Gavrilyuk outlines some cognitive tricks we use. First up, accessibility of limited aspects. What's that in simple terms?
It just means that at any one time, only a small part of your total self-concept is active or accessible in your mind, like a mental spotlight.
Okay.
The study he mentions by Fazio is cool. They subtly primed people to think about times they were introverted or extroverted. And guess what? That little nudge actually influenced how they describe themselves and even behave shortly after.
Wow. So context can really pull different parts of us to the surface.
Definitely. Who we're with, what we're doing, it primes different facets of our identity.
Okay, next strategy. Selective recall of past facts. This sounds like we're editing our own life story a bit.
We absolutely are. We tend to remember our past in ways that align with our current self-image.
Yeah.
If you see yourself now as confident, you might remember past events in a way that emphasizes your confidence, maybe downplaying times you felt unsure.
Like personal revisionist history?
Gavrilyuk even compares it, maybe a bit dramatically, to totalitarian regimes rewriting history. We do it to create a coherent narrative about ourselves.
They also try to avoid inconsistencies, right? Like if I do something totally out of character, I blame the situation, not myself.
Oh, classic attribution error, yes. I snapped because the traffic was awful. Not, maybe I have an anger management issue. It protects our view of ourselves as consistent.
Makes sense. Then there's inclination of self-worth or self-affirmation theory. How does that work?
The idea is we're motivated to see ourselves positively. So if we get negative feedback that threatens our self-esteem in one area, say, we fail a test, we might cope by focusing on another area where we feel good about ourselves.
Like, okay, I bombed the math test, but I'm a really talented artist.
Exactly. You affirm another valued aspect of yourself to maintain an overall positive self-view.
And the last one is focusing on central features, or self-schemas. These act like filters.
Right. Self-schemas are our core beliefs about who we are. I am intelligent, I am shy, I am athletic. We tend to notice, process, and remember information that confirms these schemas.
And ignore or explain away stuff that contradicts them, like the humorous person whose jokes fall flat.
Precisely. They might not even register the lack of laughter because it doesn't fit their self-schema. And this leads to the self-reference effect. We just naturally pay more attention to things related to ourselves.
Okay, so just to quickly recap those terms. Social identity is self-definition via group membership. Self-concept is that internal scheme of beliefs and feelings about ourselves.
Correct. William James was onto this self-evaluation piece early on, and the Who Am I test is a classic way to tap into self-concept.
What kinds of things do people typically list when they do that test?
Oh, it's a mix. Social roles, student, mother, engineer, group memberships, nationality, religion, fan club. Personal traits: kind, anxious, funny. Physical attributes, beliefs, values, even possessions can come up as self-relevant.
Interesting. And Marcus's theory distinguishes between that stable core self and the more flexible working self or possible selves,
Yeah.
right?
She talks about our stable self-schemas versus the working self-concept, which is the bit that's active right now, influenced by the immediate situation.
And possible selves.
Those are our ideas about who we might become, the hoped-for selves, the feared selves. They're really important for motivation and giving us direction. She also talked about schematic versus aschematic people. Schematic means you have a really clear, important self-schema in a certain area, like athleticism. Aschematic means it's not really central to how you define yourself.
Got it. And all this ties into self-esteem, how we feel about ourselves. Gavriliuk links it to the gap between our actual self-concept and our ideal self.
Right. The bigger the discrepancy between who you think you are and who you'd ideally like to be, the more likely you are to have lower self-esteem or negative feelings about yourself.
Carl Rogers was big on this, wasn't he? His therapy aimed to reduce that gap.
Exactly. Client-centered therapy focuses on helping people accept themselves and close that gap, fostering a more positive self-concept through empathy and acceptance.
Okay, let's pivot now to culture. This is a huge influence. How does Gavriliuk bring culture into the picture using self-construal?
He uses Hofstede's well-known distinction between individualistic and collectivist cultures as a starting point.
Right, independent versus interdependent self. What's the core difference?
In strongly individualistic cultures, like the US or Western Europe, the emphasis is on the independent self. People are seen as unique, autonomous individuals defined by their internal attributes, traits, abilities, goals. Self-expression is key.
Be yourself, stand out.
Pretty much. Whereas in many collectivist cultures in parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, the interdependent self is more common. Identity is defined more by relationships, social roles, and connections to the group.
Fitting in, maintaining harmony, group success, those are more valued.
Generally, yes. Your identity is interwoven with your social context. Gavriliuk includes a table summarizing this definition of self, structure, important features, key tasks. It really highlights the contrasts.
But he cautions against seeing this as purely black and white, right?
Oh, absolutely. He, along with Marcus and Kitayama and others, stresses that this is a spectrum, not a rigid dichotomy. Real people and cultures are way more complex.
You can find interdependent tendencies in individualistic cultures and vice versa.
For sure. He even mentions research showing Romanian participants scoring higher on both interdependence and certain aspects of independence compared to Americans. It suggests cultural models are much more nuanced.
And there are models now, like the 7+1 factor model, that try to capture that complexity better, moving beyond just East versus West.
Exactly. These newer models look at multiple facets of independence and interdependence, giving a much richer picture of how culture shapes the self across the globe. It avoids those simplistic stereotypes.
No, something very contemporary. Identity in the digital age. This feels like a whole new layer of complexity. Gavriliuk mentions digital footprints and the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
Yeah, that was a real wake-up call, wasn't it? It showed how seemingly innocuous online behavior, likes, shares, group memberships, creates these massive data sets.
Which can then be used to build really detailed profiles.
Disturbingly detailed. Cambridge Analytica used these profiles, generated often without people's full awareness or consent, to target political messaging very precisely.
It shows how our online actions become this resource for diagnosing us individually and as groups.
And the research by Kaczynski and colleagues that Gavriliuk cites is pretty stunning. Just from Facebook likes, they could predict things like sexual orientation, ethnicity, political views, personality traits.
With scary accuracy, right. I remember seeing some of those percentages for predicting things like being gay or heterosexual or black or white.
Yeah, remarkably high accuracy for some attributes. It really underscores what they called the non-private character of self-information online. Our digital selves are more exposed than we might think.
It definitely makes you think about identity vulnerability in this networked world.
Hmm.
So this brings us back to the interplay between personal identity, our inner sense of self, and social identity, the group part. Gavrilyuk leans towards the interactionist view to bridge this. He mentions Cooley and Mead.
Right. Cooley's looking glass self, we see ourselves reflected in how others react to us. And Mead's interactional self and the generalized other, our sense of self incorporates the attitudes of our community.
And then comes Henri Tajfel and social identity theory. What's the absolute core of that?
Tajfel's big idea is that our group memberships are a fundamental part of who we are and how good we feel about ourselves. Our self-esteem is tied to the status and success of our groups.
And he showed this with the minimal group studies, where even random group assignments mattered.
Exactly. Just telling people they were in the blue group or the red group based on nothing important was enough to make them favor their own group in-group favoritism.
So we naturally want our groups to be seen positively because it reflects well on us.
Yes. We strive for a positive social identity, and if our group identity feels threatened or negative, Tajfel says we have strategies. We might try to leave the group, or try to make the group look better, perhaps by emphasizing different comparison points, or we might directly compete with other groups to improve our standing.
So things like ethnic or national identity are just specific forms of this social identity, rooted in that feeling of belonging.
Precisely. And social comparison is key. Festinger talked about this. We figure out how we're doing by comparing ourselves to others. Tajfel applied it to groups. Groups define themselves often by comparing themselves to other groups.
Usually trying to find ways to seem better or distinct, right?
Yeah.
To maximize the positive difference.
Often, yes. This drives in-group attachment, but can also fuel out-group discrimination. It's all linked back to seeking that positive social identity for self-esteem.
Okay. And then J.C. Turner added more emphasis on the cognitive side, defining social identities as cognitive groupings of the self.
Right. Turner focused on categorization. We need to categorize the social world to make sense of it, even if we rely on stereotypes sometimes. Lippmann and Allport talked about this earlier.
And Turner proposed different levels of categorization.
Yeah, a kind of hierarchy.
Yeah.
At the broadest level, it's human versus non-human. Then it's in-group versus out-group, us versus them. And finally, within the in-group, it's personal differentiation, me versus other members of my group.
And what's this functional antagonism idea?
It means that when one level of categorization becomes really salient, say, the in-group, out-group level, the other levels become less important. So if my national identity feels threatened, I might see myself less as a unique individual and more as a typical member of my nation.
Ah, so you get depersonalization, seeing yourself and fellow in-group members as more interchangeable, more homogenous.
Exactly. And this can amplify stereotyping of the outgroup and justify seeing them as different, sometimes negatively. It shapes how we expect them to behave. Cognitive theories suggest we do this partly because it's just easier, less mental effort to think in terms of group stereotypes.
So pulling it together, Gavrilyuk presents identity as this mix. Personal and social, real and constructed, shaped by shared cognitions and social practices. It's a dynamic system.
Absolutely. It involves group belonging, cognitive mechanisms, but also, and this is crucial, the socio-political context.
Right. Power dynamics. Florenzi, Cioldi, and Doys argue that power imbalances can actually reverse how identity works.
Yes. Their work and Lemaine's experiments suggest that dominant and subordinate groups might articulate their identities differently. For instance, facing a higher status outgroup might paradoxically lead lower status groups to emphasize internal differentiation to find some basis for positive distinctiveness.
But there's also the oppression hypothesis.
Right, which suggests that lower status groups might sometimes feel less encouraged to focus on individual uniqueness. Their identity might be more defined collectively, often in opposition to the dominant group. Meanwhile, members of the dominant group might feel more freedom to define themselves individually.
Florenzi, Cioldi, and Doys had a model for this based on group prestige, didn't they?
They did. Their dual differentiation model suggests that high-prestige, dominant groups often encourage personalization. Members define themselves by their similarities to the valued in-group, leading to a more autonomous, individual identity.
Okay. And low prestige groups.
For lower prestige, dominated groups, identity might be defined more through differences from the dominant outgroup. This can lead to a more collective, less differentiated identity, perhaps seen as more externally defined or heteronymous.
Gavrilyuk uses some powerful examples here, like the difference between how a black man from the Bronx versus a privileged white S might construct their primary identity in a racially stratified society.
It's a stark illustration. One identity might be strongly tied to the collective ethnic racial experience, the other more focused on personalized achievements and traits.
Or the historical example of Romanians in Transylvania before 1918. Facing discrimination from the dominant Hungarian group, their shared ethnicity became a central, unifying identity marker.
Absolutely, and even groups facing extreme oppression, like deportees finding unity in shared suffering and their difference from the oppressor. It shows how these external power structures profoundly shape internal identity processes.
It really drives home that identity isn't just in our heads, it's forged in the crucible of social and political reality.
Couldn't have said it better. Understanding these power dynamics is key.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive into Gavrilyuk's work, it really paints a picture of identity that's far more intricate, more layered than we might usually think.
Definitely. It's not just answering who am I once.
No, it's this constant dance, isn't it? Between the individual and the social, between our internal feelings and external recognition, heavily influenced by culture and even shaped by power structures, and now the digital world.
A complex, ongoing construction project.
So for everyone listening, as you reflect on all this, maybe take a moment to think about your own identity. How does understanding this social construction, this interplay of forces, maybe shift how you see yourself? What are the different threads, personal, social, cultural tapes that make up your own tapestry? And what forces, maybe ones you hadn't considered before, might have helped weave them together?
It's a really worthwhile reflection.
Definitely something to chew on.
Yeah.
Hopefully this dive gave you some new perspectives for that ongoing exploration.